My name is Jude Blanchette, and I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS. Welcome to this morning's Interpret China event on Chinese assessments of counter-sanction strategies, which we're happy to be co-hosting with the CSIS Economics Program Senior Fellow Gerard DiPippo. This is the latest in our series of Interpret China events where we curate and translate and then publish on the Interpret China website a series of articles or longer assessments written by Chinese scholars on topics of critical importance. So previous Interpret China events have looked at Chinese assessments of the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative. We have done, our most recent event looked at how Chinese scholars and analysts were assessing the fall of the Soviet Union and what that told us about the bounds of political debate in China. And so given events since Putin's invasion of Ukraine last year and the sanctions that were levied on Russia by the United States and a series of allies and partners, we wanted to take a moment and listen to the conversation and debate in China about how Chinese scholars were assessing the effect and power and approach of U.S. sanctions, and more importantly, how some Chinese scholars were talking about ways that Beijing was or should be considering to mitigate and end run those sanctions. So we have translated 3 long assessments, which you can either go to csis.org, click on the events page for this specific event, and you can download the articles as a long PDF, or you can go to our Interpret China website and look at the articles individually under library. Just one quick methodological note before I turn it over to Gerard to start today's program, which is the challenge here is we can't translate 1 million articles, which would be the entirety of the Chinese discussion. So we have to make some choices. And I just want to caveat the discussion today to say we have tried to select articles which we think give a snapshot of the debate and discussion or some of the debate and discussion in China about sanctions. But this is not, nor should this be taken to represent, quote, what China thinks about any given issue. These are a select group of scholars thinking out loud, and they represent certain positions on the spectrum. The authors here, 2 of them work for various parts of the People's Bank of China, which is China's central bank, and one of them is at the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences. So they're important to listen to. These articles we think are important to interrogate, but of course they are not the entirety of the discussion. So I only say this because if at some point in the discussion you're thinking, well, they should have translated a different article, I will say at the top, you are probably right. There's an infinite number of really good articles we were not able to translate, but hopefully there's still, the audience will still find value in this discussion. So with that long throat clearing out of the way, for context, introduction, and to introduce today's speakers, let me please turn it over to Comrade Gerard DiPippo.
Thank you, Jude. Good morning. Welcome to CSIS. So today we're going to be talking about some Chinese views of China's counter-sanction strategy and the views basically of U.S. financial sanctions and the vulnerabilities therein for China. So today we have a great panel. First, we have Martin Chorzempa, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Next, we have Barry Naughton. Barry doesn't actually need an introduction, but I'll do it anyway. He is the Kwan Chair of Chinese International Affairs at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California in San Diego. And finally, we have joining us from Europe, Maria Shagina, who is the Diamond Brown Senior Research Fellow for Economic Sanctions, Standards, and Strategy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Welcome, all 3. So to get us kicked, to start us, I thought we would sort of ask, let's talk about the narrative, kind of the historical narrative that emerges in these documents. So basically, how do they perceive the evolution and motivations behind U.S. financial sanctions? Martin, let me turn to you for that one.
Sure. So one article is almost entirely about this, which is framed around the weaponization of global public goods, as they put it. So their idea is that sanctions have been used more and more over time, especially with the post-World War II and post-Cold War order, and especially after the terrorist attacks in 2001. And that's been enabled by the hegemonic position of the United States dollar, United States financial institutions, which in a sense provides little good alternative to using the US dollar for many transactions. So essentially, they say this is possible and has relatively limited costs for the US to impose sanctions because there isn't much in the way of good alternatives. In terms of the motivations, they say, it's something the Western countries don't want to use military. That's too expensive and potentially politically costly at home as well. So instead, it's easy to attack their geopolitical opponents with sanctions in very selfish ways. Some of them, what these articles say, are actually kind of interesting and probably inaccurate, saying that the U.S. imposes sanctions in order to, get people to stop investing in Iran and instead to go to the U.S. dollar to kind of attract capital and scare people away from other countries. I don't think that's accurate, but it shows that there's a pretty dark view in China of, even among the PBOC type people, of the motivations that the U.S. has when imposing sanctions.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, do you basically buy the historical narrative that they're presenting? It seems to me like some of the historical points, like 9/11 being an inflection point, are obviously true. But to your point, I think there is a difference in, say, like administrative or bureaucratic motivations there, right? That it's not focused on a dollar per se. It's more of just it's a muscle that we use a lot and have been using more and more, and therefore start to keep using because it's what we're used to, right?
Yeah, I think their assessments are broadly accurate in that sense. They, despite the little flourishes, anti-U.S. flourishes, a lot of it makes a lot of sense. And some of us have been, in Washington have been critical of potentially overuse of sanctions and the risks that poses to the United States. In some cases where we just put sanctions on because it's the easiest thing to do, not necessarily because they'll be effective.
Yeah, fair enough. Maria, let me turn to you. So kind of on a similar topic of, from your perspective, what are some of the biases that you see in these articles? We're not trying to nitpick all the assessments. Obviously, people can have different views, but insofar as it strikes you as sort of a different way of looking at the issue than you look at it, what stands out?
Sure. 3 biases stood out for me here, and as Martin said, some of it is true that we are in the era of weaponization of finance, but some of the picture is too black and white. And one of the aspects here to zoom in on biases from the Russian angle, from the Russian sanctions point of view, is this narrative that that's the US as the only actor that masterminded Western sanctions. So there is zero agency for the EU or the UK in the paper, that they were basically brought in as a subject of that sanctions regime. And in fact, we know that unlike 2014, a lot of coordination happened, much more than it was with the annexation of Crimea. Some sanctions, in fact, were even initiated first by the EU and the UK. One aspect here as well is on central bank sanctions. Janet Yellen, as we know now from extensive interviews done by the Washington Post and Politico, she was actually reluctant to impose sanctions on the Central Bank of Russia, worried about the same implications that are linked to the confiscation of Russian assets, about the role of the US dollar. And it was former Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi who actually intervened and sort of convinced that the measure that needs to be done. So this is the first bias that stood out for me. The second one and the third one are in the box of this backlash narrative, right? That the weaponization of finance have triggered this de-dollarization and Europe is facing energy crisis. Well, weaponization of finance did trigger de-dollarization, but there is little objective assessment of how successful it has been. If we look at Russia, some of the aspects of de-dollarization have been successful, but a lot of articles here refer to, as they see a successful example, ruble for gas payments, Well, that hasn't been successful. Many European countries simply dropped contracts with Gazprom. And now we know that Russian gas has dropped 70% pipe gas to Europe. The same narrative is that Russia and India were in talks about the national currency payments. Now we know from media that the talks were abandoned simply because neither Russia nor India need each other's currencies. The same sort of this doom and gloom scenario that Europe is facing energy crisis. Russia did weaponize its energy power, superpower status. That's what it has to put against Western weaponization of finance, but it also didn't bear fruit. As we know now, Europe isn't in the worst energy crisis ever. The prices have calmed down. Also, the gas storages are much better than it was before. The next winter is still we're not out of the woods, but we're not talking about energy crisis. And that's actually for Russia to find new suppliers than for Europe.
Thank you. I mean, in fairness to the authors, we should probably flag that these articles came out in August or October of last year, so they were probably written about 9 months ago. And in the sanctions / de-dollarization world, it's a very long time now. Barry, do you have any additional thoughts on what strikes you as a certain bias in the articles?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm really struck by the precondition that all of this is happening within the context of long-term rivalry between China and the United States for dominance. And therefore, when they, I think we tend to look at the financial sanctions and say, well, this is a policy within the matrix of the global economy. I think they look at it and say, this is one action among many potential threatening actions that the aging hegemon, the United States, is throwing at us. We need to figure out a way, short-term and long-term, to blunt it and improve our own bargaining power in response. So it's a really different strategic matrix, I think.
Let me stay with you, Barry. So on the question of, sort of at a high level, what are the perceived strengths and weaknesses of China's ability to counter or mitigate financial sanctions? How do they see the basic problem?
Well, I think, my impression, going over a couple different authors who, of course, see things differently, is that they absolutely view their huge trade and their dominance of so many important supply chains as being their fundamental aid. I mean, they see that financial sanctions are limited because, after all, there are just so many merchandise good trade areas where the United States and other Western countries are very, very dependent on China. So after a period of emphasizing self-reliance, I think they've got to the point now where they're saying just as much, actually, we should intensify the dependence of other countries on us in the merchandise trade area so that they don't have as free a hand to initiate sanctions if necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe the crude way to put it is the U.S. has financial dominance, but China has manufacturing or trade dominance, and that's you have to play to your strengths. Actually, Martin, let me turn to you on a related questions. So, if you were trying to describe what are the elements of Chinese counter-sanction strategy, at least insofar as it's presented in these documents, what would you say? And are there sort of offensive versus defensive elements to it?
Yeah, I think very interestingly, the main way I would summarize it is beef up your compliance department and rigorously follow U.S. law to avoid getting secondary sanctioned. So I think there's really a recognition in these documents that the main thing China has to do at this point is not develop the ECNY or diversify its reserves. They do mention those things, but really the immediate thing is do not get yourself on the OFAC sanctions list by serving sanctioned entities. So they recognize that it's really a long-term thing that they could potentially reduce, but they actually diagnose the Russia issue and say that Russia failed in its Fortress Russia strategy. Now, there's a quote in one of them that really says we need to improve, hold each other's assets in similar numbers and depend on each other, because they recognize that the cost to the sanctioning country depends on how much trade linkages and other financial linkages exist. So in a sense, Russia screwed up in 2014. One of the articles says that they did a good thing in 2014 by de-dollarizing and things, but they don't link that at all to the success, quote, that they attribute to Russia's response to the sanctions immediately after the invasion of Ukraine. So I think it's very, very interesting that they very much understand that the U.S. has this power and there isn't much they can do about it in the near term.
So we'll turn to the question of Russia in a bit, but one thing you mentioned at the start there that I also found interesting was their realism, right, of recognizing that there's not a whole lot they can do in the short term and just sort of accepting the reality and basically saying you have to go along with the sanctions or sort of not run afoul of them and get hit by secondary sanctions. I mean, a question we have in all these types of documents are how representative are the views, right? And obviously it's not significant with just three voices. But on that point, do you think that there is some explanatory power in the sort of realization and fear of the ability of the U.S. to use secondary sanctions and how China is in the real world approaching its relationship with Russia during the war?
Yeah, completely. I mean, if we go back to the discussions that were happening in Washington right after the invasion of Ukraine, there was all this discussion about how China was going to send all sorts of military equipment to Russia. There's a no limits partnership that they had just announced. China completely knew, that Putin was going to do this and tacitly supported. There was an idea that China was going to bail out Russia, that it was going to allow all sorts of financial transactions. And what you see is largely that not being the case, at least in the early days after the invasion. The number of Chinese entities that have been accused of supplying Russia with military goods is very small. UnionPay very publicly said, we don't want to be involved in helping out all these sanctioned Russian banks to continue to do transactions because we don't want to get sanctioned too. And even Huawei pulled out of Russia to a great extent because it was afraid of getting added to the SDN list when we've thrown almost everything else at them. Including bespoke export controls. So I think that their behavior shows that it's not just the technocratic financial bureaucracy, the quote reformers who think this way, or at least that the reformers made it clear to the Chinese leadership that it would not make sense to risk the secondary sanctions and risk China's development in order to aid Russia. Of course, they've done things, but it really hasn't been at a scale that would invite the U.S. to hit China hard, which we would have almost certainly if they had played that kind of role.
Yeah, agreed. And also, I mean, keep in mind that the Chinese economic actors are still largely decentralized, right? So even if they're SOEs, they have their own compliance concerns and they're aware of what U.S. sanctions can detect and how the U.S. would respond. Because I agree that if they cross those red lines, I think the U.S. government would feel compelled to respond, and they're acting as such, like that they are assuming that that's the case. So just sticking with their sort of views of their toolkit, is there anything in that toolkit that they talk about that might be seen as like offensive as opposed to sort of just begging to try to comply with the U.S. sanctions and not get punched?
They do mention, using the countersanctions tool as deterrence, but really I don't see much in the way of offense there. I think they recognize that they don't have the hegemonic position in finance that the United States does. So most of what they're talking about is some insurance, some deterrence, but nothing really. I don't see anything in any of those articles that actually would be an effective attack on the United States or using its own authority.
So we'll in a bit turn to like what China can do in the longer term, but I think in a more retrospective sense, let's stay on the Russia topic. So Maria, can you just, assuming that most of the audience here is more of a China-oriented audience, so for them, given your Russia expertise, can you just briefly summarize what Russia did after 2014 to quote de-dollarize or try to create, Fortress Russia?
Sure. Can I just quickly chip in on the previous question?
Of course,
That was really fascinating. I agree with Martin, just to echo some of the points. I also think there is little appetite for offensive tools, which for me as a non-China expert was quite surprising. There is a lot of emphasis on strengthening anti-sanction, anti-interference law, but not really triggering them. So my question that I have, is it because China has traditionally been using this informal use of statecraft, and that's where they see their advantage, as we've seen with anti-espionage law or raiding Western companies, all the sorts of measures that can have plausible deniability. But so far they see this, the existence of these laws will act as self-deterrence by itself. And the second point, as Martin said, really strong emphasis on just complying with US sanctions, paying attention to OFAC 50% rule, improving due diligence, avoiding third-party sanctions risk. And someone who studied Russia-China relations since 2014, that's what China did. The private sector was really reluctant to step into area which would trigger secondary sanctions. Now, the news of today is that China is allegedly supplying gas turbines to Novatek sanctioned Arctic LNG terminal in the Arctic. So that for me is an interesting ground, because before China was really reluctant to step into the zone, EU sanctions prohibit any supply of LNG equipment to the Arctic. So how it will evolve will be interesting. Whether there will be any sanctions risk or appetite for China to take is interesting. But turning to the de-dollarization question, China, so what was surprising for China, I guess, this time is that the sheer amount of, the amount of sanctions, the swiftness and unity that were imposed, and we're talking about these big multilateral sanctions coalitions, right? So in that sense, Russia's de-dollarization wasn't 100% this shield for the Kremlin. It has been partially successful in diversifying its foreign reserves from the US dollar to mainly to euro, to Japanese yen and other Western currencies. But because the multilateral sanctions coalitions were so encompassing, it has proven to be basically futile, right? So now we have around $300 billion that are immobilized in the West. And Russia is left with what China will have to struggle with is gold reserves and Chinese yuan. So the big question for China is how to, some of the papers also touch upon this, how to restructure its foreign reserves. So China has already ramped up gold reserves, but how do you pivot to other non-Western currencies if it's not yuan? You can't pivot to yourself. So that's one issue. The second strand that Russia did, and China is also, I think, on the looking out for this, is internationalization of its currency in cross-border payments, right? So the yuan is now accounts for about 2%. The ruble is much less, is really non-existent in the tracking system. But what we've seen, which wasn't actually in the papers, any linkage to internationalize yuan with Russia. We haven't seen any reference to that, which I was a bit surprising. But if we look at the trajectory, how that has changed, that now it's very much ruble and yuan between Russia and China, that has really substantially changed since February 22, but none of the papers really touch upon this. And the third one that Russia did, and China, I think, was even the first one after Iran sanctions, is this creation of alternative infrastructure. So we're talking about alternatives to SWIFT, alternatives to MasterCard, visas. And that's where I think both Russia and China face these external constraints. So they might be useful for internal use. And for Russia, SPFS is the SWIFT alternative, or Mir card, which is substitute for Visa cards, have been helpful to conduct domestic transactions within Russia. But we're not talking about external outreach, right? So many countries, especially after the US issued FAQ saying any collaboration with Russian Mir card will basically face secondary sanctions, not naming secondary by its name, but basically implying that quickly you have a number of countries that dropped out, including Chinese Union Pay. So, and I think one of the papers recognizes the limitations for SIPs, right? That it's still very much dependent on SWIFT and more so on Western software and hardware, something that Russian system is also very much vulnerable to.
So we will go down the SIPs and alternative networks rabbit hole pretty soon. But you said something early on in your comment that I want to double back on and pivot to Barry, which is basically your observation as someone who's not normally obsessed with China as much as we are, that they seem to be relying more on informal mechanisms. And is there some sort of institutional or historical explanation of that? Barry, I think you're the perfect person to answer that question.
I think Mary really laid it out in a great sense. I mean, I think China sees an advantage in the fact that they can coordinate actors internally and as she put it, plausible deniability. So, they have experience, not necessarily successful, but I think everybody in the world knows, including Italy, say that China might decide to retaliate informally in all kinds of hard to track ways against behavior they view as being hostile. So I think it's right that they have a set of a toolbox of informal and deniable tools that they would rely on first in smaller scale conflicts.
I should put in a product plug for CSIS, the Economics Program, did an economic coercion report looking at China's use of economic coercion. One of the conclusions there is that, generally speaking, in the case studies we looked at, China uses informal mechanisms in part to preserve plausible deniability. So they don't, in the US, we're very legally oriented, right? So if you're on the SDN list and OFAC puts you up on the website, you can see it. People have to comply with it. China has its own version of that, sort of called the unreliable entities list, which has only been used for the first time recently against two U.S. companies, Lockheed and Raytheon, mostly to pretty limited effect. And so it's a much more sort of informal environment that is, I think, a function of how policy works, but also they didn't have the sort of institutional tools yet to make that in a more formalized sense. So let's pivot back to the Russia case. I mean, Maria, you made a lot of great points that I want to pull on. But just to answer the question, like looking at what these documents say, at least as of when they were written, or maybe if you think things have changed since then, let me know. Is China adopting a fortress China strategy in the way that Russia did? So Russia, you mentioned they de-dollarized away from their reserves. They switched to RMB, gold, to some extent to euro. They reduced their offshore dollar borrowing for their state-owned enterprises, et cetera. Are we seeing similar actions with China? And what is being proposed here, is that of the same sort of broad strategic approach? Martin, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, they really don't seem to be following a fortress China strategy. One of my favorite excerpts from one of the articles when they said we need to strengthen academic exchange with the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and kind of do a bear hug essentially to the global financial system and SWIFT and everything. And they propose having more representatives from emerging markets on SWIFT's executive committee. If you look at what they've actually done, they have encouraged SWIFT to set up a joint venture in Beijing, and they use SWIFT messaging standards and actually use SWIFT itself for the cross-border elements of the cross-border interbank payment system, the CSIS. So, if you're looking at, is CSIS a replacement to SWIFT, it's kind of hilarious that the cross-border element literally doesn't replace SWIFT at all. It just does things beyond what SWIFT does. So I think they recognize that the most important lever they have is to make it too expensive for the United States to impose, too expensive and too risky for the United States to impose major financial sanctions on China. And if you look at the U.S. policy response to all of the perceived issues with China on the tech and elsewhere, you see that sanctions is one thing that really hasn't been used very much. It's really interesting that Huawei, for example, is not on the SDN list. And I think it's due to a recognition of the global spillover effects that would have. So they're clearly taking the lesson that this is this is not what you want to do. Interestingly, they recognize that there's more of a multilateral coalition now to use sanctions than in the past, and that's something that they're grappling with of how that applies to China. But they say that in relation to China, there is not and actually to sanctions in general, there's not a unified Western strategy, and often there's frictions. They mention one of the most important things I noticed is they mentioned the system that the Europeans did to try and get around sanctions, the Instex system, which was supposed to allow them to transact with Iran. And they say, look, the Europeans banded together and created this thing. What they don't mention is that utterly failed and was wrapped up without having really achieved anything at all because of the breach of the sanctions. So I think they're pretty clearly recognize that that's not going to work.
So you already mentioned CIPS, and I think Maria mentioned it too. So let's just pull that thread a bit. So as you say, CIPS is the cross-border interbank payment system that China uses. It's is it most? I know it's mostly in RMB. Is it only in RMB, Martin?
I don't know, but I think so because it's a payment. It's a system that it's SWIFT for all the non-financial infrastructure nerds. SWIFT is simply a messaging system. It's just how a bank tells another one, please transfer this amount of money. And then the rails, as we call it, of how that money actually moves from one account to the other is somewhat independent of using SWIFT. And most of that goes through actually New York. So you might have a Korean firm and a Chinese firm trading with each other using the dollar in between the Kwan and the renminbi. And the actual money changing hands is going to happen physically, in computers in New York, because that's really the only way you can safely transact in dollars. And so the CIPS system, the cross-border interbank payment system that China has, is designed to provide a better ability to use the renminbi in cross-border payments. So it goes beyond SWIFT in that it's not just messaging; it also actually moves money, but it is less than SWIFT in a sense in that it relies on SWIFT because SWIFT is the language that all the banks speak when they talk to each other around the world. So having your own standard, kind of like having your own, telecom standard where your phones won't work anywhere outside of your country is really inefficient, and they recognize that.
And so on the messaging part of this, I have seen or heard conflicting things. So I know it's generally accepted that CIPS uses SWIFT for messaging, but there's supposedly this CIPS only internal messaging system that I've seen referenced in places, but it's hard to quantify it. But whenever I've asked people who might know, like, does anyone use this? I've never heard anyone say yes. Have you heard anything on that, Martin?
I have not. My understanding is that among Chinese banks who are direct participants of CIPS and are trading among each other, I think there's a way for them to do that without necessarily using SWIFT, but that the interbank elements of it, and that's what, if you look very carefully at what was said in the PBOC author's article that was translated, it says the cross-border element of it uses SWIFT for messaging, but not necessarily the other part. So I think there's a kind of shifting line of them recognizing they maybe want to have some system which could be operated. They're very concerned. I think there's more concern than these articles show about being cut off from SWIFT, especially after the Russian banks were de-SWIFted. If Chinese banks, for example, actually found themselves on a sanctions list as a result of, say, a mainland invasion of Taiwan, that would be catastrophic for many of them. I mean, the blocking sanctions would be much more impactful than the dropping from SWIFT. But right now, there's very limited alternative, and that makes them very, very nervous about this because, even though they can tell themselves, and I think it's accurate, that the costs would be immense to the United States of putting Chinese major banks, not like little Bank of Kunlun, Bank of Dandong, North Korea, sanctions avoiding specialized institutions. But if you put a Bank of China, ICBC on those lists, you would have immense ripple effects around the world. Doesn't mean it's not going to happen. Doesn't mean that Congress won't pass some law that would require putting them on, even if the people in the Treasury Department know just how costly that would be. So it's a major risk for China. They're kind of trapped.
Yeah, let's be more explicit about what you're saying there, which is under what conditions would we think, or maybe the authors of these papers think, China might be vulnerable to the actual use of sanctions that they're talking about here. So the extreme case is, a war over Taiwan, right? That you could easily imagine, at least I can, that the U.S. would use, go nuclear, so to speak, on the financial side, particularly if U.S. forces are engaged. But are there other scenarios where they would worry about where the risk of this kind of systemic use of sanctions, let's call it like Russia level sanctions, is that plausible in any other contingency? Barry or Martin?
I don't think that they don't really mention this. They say that a scattered amount of companies who facilitated trade with Russia or Iran find themselves on the lists, but the risks of that are controllable, as they say, and there aren't very many. So they really actually mostly focused, it seems, on the indirect contagion effects on China of sanctions on other countries, not as much on directly sanctions on China.
Although I do think that in the back of their mind, there certainly is the possibility that things in the South China Sea or North Korea, or even potentially the Himalayas, could lead to a short-run crisis where they might run into some of this. Of course, they're not talking about this very much, but it's something in the back of their minds for sure.
So let's look at the topic of RMB internationalization. Barry, can you explain, I guess, a few things. One, what is the view of that as portrayed in these papers, and what strikes you about that? But two, how does that broad effort relate to CIPS, which Martin was just talking about?
I'll defer the CIPS question to Martin, who certainly understands it far better than I do. What's striking to me is that in distinction to the situation a decade ago, where China was really trying to position the RMB to be an international currency and was willing to take some risks in opening the capital account in order to do that. And there was a lot of sometimes unrealistic excitement around the world about how, what kind of role the RMB could follow internationally. Those hopes and aspirations are pretty clearly drained from our Chinese commentators today. They're really talking much more about an incremental increase in the use of the RMB, especially for trade, for settlement purposes. So, the idea that suddenly the RMB is going to emerge as a major investment currency and everything has clearly gotten a real dose of cold water. So most of the views that we were reviewing really seem to think of increased role for the RMB as being something gradual, steady, get it in place for transactions with as many countries as possible, but that's something that's going to take a decade at least.
Although on the trade settlement side, we put out a commentary on this recently, that looking at the Chinese data, which you can't really disaggregate, you can just sort of look at what trade settlement is and overlay it with total trade, but it looks like on an annualized basis, it's like 23% of China's cross-border trade as of first quarter this year is being settled in RMB, which is up at least 10 or 12 percentage points from a year earlier. So they are making some progress, but it's actually less than was the case in 2015 before the devaluation. You mentioned that they sort of given up at least some of the hope they had before about capital account liberalization and openness. But one thing that strikes me is that, at least in I think it's the last article, but one of the PBOC affiliated articles, there does seem to be an element of like, rather than fortifying closing up, why don't we just keep it up, opening up more? And it's, as Martin was saying, sort of like the bear hug strategy, right? Is that by broader integration, they might be able to deter the use of sanctions against China. So, do you think that that's sort of just vestigial PBOC liberal thinking, or is it actually part of the overall strategy?
I think a little of both. For sure, there are, we observe in all these translated articles the fact that people will endorse the official line and then sort of subtly push their particular views and their particular interpretation. But I think it's also very consistent that it is indeed the strategy is to open up more, but under circumstances where the bargaining power in a tense situation is tilted as much as possible in China's favor. So, even though we can certainly agree that in broad strokes, manufacturing power and trade dominance is the basis of Chinese power. But then they would say, well, yes, but within that, we're still very, very dependent on the United States, Japan, Korea, Europe for key technological inputs, as has been certainly brought home to them by the whole set of October 7th sanctions on semiconductors. So at the same time that they're strategizing response to the financial sanctions, they're also making a systematic effort to de-risk, de-Americanize their manufacturing base and make it stronger and self-sufficient. So that's for the long term. They certainly see that as part of their response.
Yeah. Martin, do you want to just address the question about what is the linkage between CSIS itself and RB internationalization?
Sure. So I really I agree with super strongly with Barry that all the discussions about renminbi internationalization being a major driver of Chinese policy have kind of fallen away. They made it into the SDR. They made some reforms. A lot of those seem to have backfired on them. When they liberalized the trading of the renminbi, there was a sharp depreciation that led to some instability that I think discredited a lot of that effort. And even some of the most positive people about capital account liberalization in the past are now saying there's no good time to open the capital account because if capital's flowing in, then you do it, you get complacent, and then things blow up when it doesn't work out. So I'd be pretty bearish on renminbi internationalization. CSIS link is interesting. You have to look at, are more and more institutions using CSIS outside of China? What do you see? There's a lot of narrative about de-dollarization. And I think what you see is it's very incremental. One way to think about it is that de-dollarizing is kind of like leaving China as a manufacturing place. There are lots of headlines about it, but what you actually see is a small amount of diversification going on into other places that still retains the core of China dependence in those supply chains. The same thing I think is true in the dollar dominance literature. And I've been following CSIS volumes every month, and there was a little rise after the Russia invasion, but they've been pretty stable. And if you look at the renminbi's role in the SWIFT network, which gives a monthly breakdown of the components of financial transactions on messages on SWIFT in different currencies, you see that China's currency is actually used less than it was pre-invasion, despite a short-term spike, I think, when a lot of Russian business was kind of being diverted around there. Now it's settling down to be lower, and the CSIS doesn't seem to be making up for that decline and making it a much larger share. So I really don't see the big boost to CSIS from the Russia invasion, and in part that's due to the unity of this imposing sanctioning countries. China says it's the West. In multiple of these articles, they say the U.S. and the West, but actually, Korea, Japan, Singapore, other countries that are not very much not in the West have joined in, and that's just made the dollar more attractive in a sense, because now the perception is not you're risking sanctions only by using the dollar, but it's you're risking sanctions by using any reserve currency.
But so, I mean, I agree with that analytically, but it strikes me that in the articles, they're still fixated on the dollar and not so much on the potential of a repeat of what happened to Russia, meaning a G7 plus sanction regime that effectively cuts off all reserve currencies except for the RMB, which is not actually a reserve currency for China because it's their own currency. And so it's like, in a way, they're not sort of grappling with the severity of the problem. But on the other hand, it might be that they just don't think that kind of sanctions regime against China is possible, right?
Yeah, I think that it would be an accurate diagnosis by them. I spend a lot of time talking to European and other countries, and pretty unanimously, they have a lot of positive things to say about what they might do if there's an invasion of Taiwan, for example. But when the rubber hits the road, my sense is that coalition would be much harder to put together because, as China has correctly diagnosed, there is so much more dependence on China on the financial and economic trade side, as Barry mentioned, that the costs would be enormous, and the shared sense of threat to, say, European security, which existed in the Russia-Ukraine case, definitely does not exist in the China case. So I would be, if I were in these countries thinking from the perspective of a Chinese official, I would be much more concerned about unilateral U.S. sanctions than the others, even though the Russia case would seem to give you the opposite view.
So there's two more technical things I want to talk about, which is the ECNY and swaps. But before we do that, Maria, I wanted to ask you something I should have actually asked earlier, which is that at a high level, besides the fact that the Chinese economy is just way bigger than the Russian economy, what is the difference in your view between China's, let's say, economic/financial position and its vulnerability to sanctions compared to Russia's prior to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine?
Well, as Martin said, there is a big difference, right? So China is very confident that it's too big to sanction, and it's banking on this status, right? Which is true. But as we've seen, the visuals of the war, the invasion might change the trajectory of things. Building sanction coalitions when it comes to China will definitely be much harder, simply because we're talking about countries in Southeast Asia, but also Northeast Asia, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, who are much more dependent. And having just returned from Singapore, the main narrative, the main concern from there, how not to be forced to choose sides. And that's the main concern for example, for Singaporean policymakers, and I think it will echo just around the region as well. So Japan has adopted probably the most sophisticated strategy, how to navigate hedging strategy, with businesses still trying to be linked to China, but still the government is rather, well, with G7 summit coming up this week, right? It's very much assertive to come up with some sort of formulation how to define economic coercion against China. So it's hard to basically compare maybe oranges and apples here, but China still has some vulnerabilities, as was discussed, right? It's the dependence on financial infrastructure, dependence on the US dollar. That's something that they are very much aware of, but also in the technological domain, right? The main difference, sort of going back to the question whether Beijing is adopting a fortress strategy, I would say yes, it might not be the Russia fortress strategy, but it's still a fortress, which is to me captured in this geo-circulation strategy, that you still want to reach out, to capitalize, to really tap in the capital, financial, and technological domains, what's out there, but also to seal, to close off the most strategically important assets. And that's what I think Barry pointed out, where it's strategically important, like semiconductor industry, there is this drive to achieve self-sufficiency. Whether it's attainable, it's a big question mark. No country can do that. But there is this increasing narrative since Russia sanctions that China needs to be more defensive, to increase strengthen its domestic resilience. And as one of the paper put it, it will be a bedrock for withstanding the risk of sanctions. So for China, for example, in the technological domain, right? Unlike Russia, China is more or less self-sufficient in lower-end semiconductors, mature chips. So Russia is not really in that ball game. But when it comes to advanced chips, that's where its main vulnerability is. So there are still vulnerabilities which can be maybe leveraged by the West. Again, it comes with a very different price tag.
Yeah, I mean the other big one is that Russia is/was a major commodity, particularly energy exporter, whereas China is a commodity importer, but it's the leading exporter of manufactured goods. So the complexity of the dependencies the world has on China are actually is much higher because of the number of goods involved there. So we're running out of time, but I just wanted to talk about swaps and ECNY quickly. So Barry or Martin, do you have any thoughts on how it's portrayed here, or more sort of objectively, what is the role of swaps or central bank swaps for RMB internationalization, and like how does it fit into the strategy, and does it matter?
It'd be interesting to hear what Martin has to say, because my assumption is that it doesn't matter at all, that it's a kind of a face-saving arrangement that allows a warm embrace, say, of an Argentina that has plenty of problems of its own, and that it's just part of that particular type of Chinese outreach diplomacy, which affords extra face to specific specific countries that they want to favor. But maybe Martin can correct me on that view.
Martin?
Yeah, so I see it slightly differently, which is that countries around the world are concerned mainly not because of U.S. sanctions, but just because of the fact that our entire global financial system is really based to a huge extent on the dollar. And there are advantages to that in terms of efficiency, but I would liken it to the kind of increased concern around supply chain resilience, not just relying on one supplier in one country going on. So all these countries are thinking about how can we, if there is some issue with US dollars, like less that we're going to get sanctioned, more that, the Fed raises interest rates and that has all sorts of knock-on effects on us, maybe makes it hard for us to get dollars that we can use to pay for our imports or pay for our debt. How can we trade among each other, at least have some backup channel, even if it's less efficient? When that's something in one of the articles mentions, is that, we need a backup to SWIFT, even though we recognize it's less efficient. And swaps are one small piece of that, which I see as very small. I don't see it as a replacement to the dollar system. It's small, but it allows some beginning of experience trading directly among each other's currencies, even if it's pricey. One of the things I learned in looking at this subject recently is that until around 2017, it was literally not possible to trade a renminbi for a Korean won. Can you believe that? With the level of even no matter how much you wanted to not go through the dollar, you were going through the dollar. And if you think about that is pretty crazy. I mean, maybe that's a benefit to the U.S. in terms of hegemonic, whatever. But some diversification makes sense. And if you use these swap agreements to allow each other's banks to start having access to each other's currency, because often they just don't get access at all without explicit approval from the central bank, you can't really be playing around in each other's currencies and hold each other's currency. So I think it's like dipping a toe in the water and could build to something important, but more over the long term.
Right. So finally, and I have a tendency to leave digital currencies for the end, even though people like talking about them. So the ECNY / the digital RMB. How is that presented here, and to what extent, if at all, does it matter for dealing with the long arm of U.S. financial sanctions from China's perspective? Martin, I'm probably going to have to turn to you on that one.
Barely any role. I think that both Barry and Maria mentioned plausible deniability. I think there's so much hype in Washington about ECNY getting around U.S. sanctions, but plausible deniability is the biggest problem. If you have visibility into every single transaction that is occurring, which they're talking about with the ECNY, you have zero plausible deniability, and you are daring the United States to sanction the PBOC itself or the element of it that runs ECNY transactions. That is a political issue. That is not some technical way. I don't know enough about the whole clandestine side of things to know how exactly we snoop on different financial networks. But I would imagine, the way that the ECNY would be traded around the world, there might be some direct ways that happens that the U.S. might have no visibility into. But my understanding is that what Snowden revealed about SWIFT, for example, was not about U.S. snooping on financial transactions, was not that the U.S. was like snooping on SWIFT. It was that it was like American card companies networks and banks that they were using to be able to spy on or monitor transactions around the world. So I don't really see necessarily that much of a difference in the ECNY, and I don't think they do either.
So, I mean, just I guess to sum up, because we have maybe 2 minutes left. So you're saying ECNY doesn't matter all that much in terms of counter sanction strategy. Swaps, maybe, sort of, but eventually currently it's just kind of an incremental thing. And at a high level, what really needs to happen is just sort of wholesale RMB internationalization, getting other counterparties away from the dollar, not just to use the RMB, but also I mean, in the extreme case, use the RMB as a true international currency, meaning to use it for trade or transactions with non-Chinese entities. Because if let's say a Brazilian bank, if it's using RMB to trade with China, but it's still using the dollar to trade with everyone else, it's still quite vulnerable to the dollar network. So I think, my sense is the people writing these articles understand that difficulty of those network effects, and they're realistic about what can be done, which is why the RMB internationalization story is actually pretty muted in these pieces, and instead they're basically doing the bear hug strategy we mentioned earlier, of trying to further integration and essentially, they don't quite say it this way, but I think maybe they do in some parts. But it's a deterrent strategy, right? So it's rather than full insulation, because they know that's not really possible. It's just leaning into the fact that they think that a lot of countries, at least non-U.S. countries, would be unwilling to use major sanctions against China, and therefore, the more they integrate, the less likely those countries be willing to punch China. Does everyone agree with that?
Yes.
Yep.
That is, yeah. Well, I mean, I guess that's China's only optimal play, given just the nature of reality, despite all the hype about RMB internationalization. Well, I think so. We're just about out of time, unless anyone has any final thoughts they want to make quickly. Okay. Well, Barry, Martin, and Maria, thank you so much for joining us today. This is a great discussion, and thank you to everyone who tuned in or is watching us now on YouTube. So yeah, there's much more to happen in this space. This topic is not going away. We'll be doing more sanctions related research here at CSIS, so please stay tuned for that. And thank you for joining us.